If you have ever found yourself sitting in a quiet room, staring blankly at nothing, feeling disconnected from your own reflection, wondering how the person you protected, defended, and loved so deeply could treat you as if you meant so little, then something in this message will feel strangely familiar. Because what happens after a narcissist damages the person who gave them everything is not simple heartbreak. It is not ordinary sadness. It is not just a breakup. It is a deep psychological rupture that most people cannot see from the outside, and even fewer truly understand. And before going further, if you've lived through emotional manipulation, subtle psychological control, or a relationship where you slowly lost pieces of yourself without realizing it, consider subscribing to the Healing Empath. This space exists for those who are trying to understand what really happened beneath the surface: narcissistic dynamics, emotional conditioning, inner healing, and the slow rebuilding of self-worth. Sometimes, the beginning of healing is simply realizing you are not alone in what you experienced. The first thing that unfolds after this kind of relationship ends is something that is incredibly difficult to explain to anyone who has never lived it. On the outside, you appear functional. You continue your routines. You respond to messages. You go to work. You laugh at the right moments. You fulfill responsibilities. Nothing about your external life looks broken. But internally, something has gone eerily still. It feels as if a part of you has shut down. Not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly. Like a light being dimmed in a room you didn't realize you were standing in alone. There is a heaviness behind your thoughts, a strange distance between you and your own emotions. You start feeling like you are observing your life instead of living it, like your body is moving, but your presence is slightly missing from it. This is not ordinary exhaustion. It is the aftershock of emotional survival. When you spend a long time walking on emotional eggshells, predicting someone's moods just to maintain peace, suppressing your own needs just to avoid conflict, your nervous system adapts to survival mode. And when the relationship finally ends, that survival mode doesn't immediately switch off. Instead, it collapses inward. What looks like falling apart is actually your system finally releasing what it has been holding for far too long. You weren't just loving someone. You were managing an emotional environment that constantly required you to shrink yourself. And now, without realizing it, you are finally allowed to breathe again. But that first real breath feels less like relief and more like collapse. Then comes the second, even more painful realization. It is the moment you begin to understand that what you experienced was not love in the way you once believed it to be. And this realization does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds slowly, like pieces of a broken picture being placed back into view, one memory at a time. You start remembering conversations differently. Moments that once felt intimate now feel transactional. The affection that once gave you hope begins to reveal patterns: when it was given, when it was withdrawn, and what conditions were silently attached to it. You begin to notice that closeness often appeared only when you were giving, adjusting, forgiving, or proving your value. And slowly, painfully, the illusion begins to dissolve. What you thought was mutual connection starts to reveal itself as imbalance. What you believed was emotional depth begins to look like inconsistency. And what you held onto as love starts to feel like something you were constantly maintaining alone. This is not a realization that strikes like lightning. It is more like a tide that rises quietly and steadily until suddenly you are standing in the middle of memories that no longer feel the same. And the hardest part is not just losing the person. You begin to grieve the entire meaning you attach to the relationship. Because you are not only mourning who they were, you are mourning who you believed they could be. And that kind of grief is complicated. It is confusing. It makes you question your judgment, your memory, your emotions. But the truth is simple. You are not losing your mind for grieving someone who is still alive. You are grieving an emotional reality that never fully existed in the way you needed it to. And that loss deserves to be acknowledged, not dismissed. You are grieving the future you once built in your imagination. You are also grieving the version of yourself you were before all of this happened. The part of you that still trusted easily, still believed people were generally safe, still moved through life without constantly scanning for emotional danger. Then comes the third shift, and this is where things start to feel psychologically disorienting. The trauma bond begins to loosen. For a long time, your nervous system was trained to crave their attention, their approval, their unpredictable moments of warmth. The brain doesn't distinguish cleanly between love and inconsistency when it is repeatedly exposed to intermittent reinforcement. Instead, it learns to chase the reward pattern. So even when the relationship ends, or even when something inside you finally snaps awake, you don't immediately feel relief. You feel withdrawal. There is a pull. Quiet, confusing, persistent, back toward the very person who caused you pain. And you may not understand it at all. You might even judge yourself for still missing them. But this is something you need to hear clearly. Missing someone who hurt you is not proof the connection was healthy or real. It is proof that your nervous system was conditioned into attachment under emotional instability. That is not love in its purest form. It is biology responding to prolonged uncertainty and perceived survival attachment. And once you see it through that lens, the intensity doesn't disappear instantly, but it does start to lose its grip over time. The fourth shift is even more unsettling for many people. Your identity begins to feel unfamiliar, almost like you're wearing a version of yourself that no longer fits. When you spend long enough adjusting yourself to someone else's moods, softening your opinions, filtering your needs, shrinking your reactions, reshaping your personality just to keep emotional peace, you slowly lose contact with what is actually you. So when it ends, you sit with yourself and realize something uncomfortable. You don't fully know who you are outside of that dynamic anymore. What do you actually enjoy? What music feels like you? What do you want on a quiet day when nobody is watching? What does your laugh sound like when it isn't being monitored or shaped for someone else's approval? This is identity erosion, and it is one of the deepest impacts of narcissistic relationships, because what was gradually taken was not just your energy, but your sense of self. You weren't only loving them, you were constantly translating yourself into a version that felt acceptable within their emotional world. Now that translation has stopped, you are left with the task of relearning your own language. And that process takes time. There is nothing wrong with that. If any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, if it feels like something inside you recognizes these words on a deeper level, stay with it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to The Healing Empath. Not as a formality, but as a reminder that the part of you that was dismissed, minimized, or told it was too much deserves a place where it is finally understood. This space exists for rebuilding, not just awareness, but self-trust. The fifth shift is one of the most quietly powerful changes that happens after this kind of dynamic. You stop reacting the same way, not because you've gone numb and not because you no longer care, but because something fundamental inside you has shifted. The emotional spirals, the over-explaining, the late-night messages trying to make yourself understood, the repeated attempts to get clarity from someone who never gave it consistently, all of that begins to slow down, and then it stops. Not as a strategy, not as manipulation, but as exhaustion turning into clarity. At some point, you begin to understand something very simple, but very heavy. They were never going to fully see you in the way you were trying to be seen, because that level of emotional responsibility was never something they were willing or able to hold. And in that acceptance, a strange stillness arrives. This is often the moment where the narcissistic dynamic starts to lose its hold. Because for a long time, your emotional responses were part of the cycle. Your pain was engagement. Your reactions were connection. Your effort to fix things was the fuel that kept the pattern alive. When you stop feeding that cycle, when you become emotionally quieter in a way that comes from within, not performance, the dynamic loses its predictable rhythm. And that is often when they reappear. Not always with clarity, not always with real change, sometimes with softened words, sudden attention, or apologies that feel oddly familiar but incomplete. Because what is being pulled back toward you is not true understanding. It is access to the version of you that used to respond, forgive, and return. But by then, something in you has already moved. And recognizing that is where your power begins to settle. The sixth shift is the one that often feels the most confusing at first. A kind of emotional emptiness appears. But this emptiness is not the same as hopelessness. It is space. For so long, your inner world was occupied by their presence in your thoughts, their emotional needs, your anxiety about losing them, your effort to maintain stability in something unstable. There was no room left for you to exist freely inside yourself. Now that space has cleared. And at first, it can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because silence always feels strange after prolonged emotional noise. But slowly, something begins to emerge within that space. A memory of who you were before all of this. A small preference you forgot you had. A moment of joy that doesn't require permission. A quiet curiosity returning without fear attached to it. This is the beginning of emotional restoration, and it does not arrive in dramatic breakthroughs. It arrives in subtle moments that almost go unnoticed, eating a meal without anxiety, saying no without rehearsing it, looking in the mirror and not immediately criticizing what you see, feeling a moment of calm without waiting for it to be interrupted. These moments matter more than they seem. They are not small recoveries. They are structural repairs. And here is something most people are never told clearly. The narcissist does experience a form of loss when they lose someone who genuinely loved them. But it is not the same depth of grief you experience. It is not reflective, and it is not emotionally transformative in the same way. It is more like disruption than mourning, a loss of control, a loss of predictable emotional access, a gap in their usual dynamic that feels uncomfortable but not deeply self-examined. And because they don't process it in the same reflective way, they often attempt to return when their current emotional environment stops serving them, sometimes months later, sometimes years later. And when they do, they often speak in tones that resemble regret or growth or realization. But what you have to understand is this: access can sound like love when you are still healing from the absence of it. And that is where your clarity becomes your protection. Because real freedom is not found in receiving the apology you once begged for. It is found in no longer needing it. It is the moment you realize their words no longer reach the part of you that used to break open for them. And as healing continues, something unexpected happens. You begin to soften toward yourself. The same depth of care, loyalty, and emotional investment that you once poured into them slowly begins to turn inward, not as self-pity, but as recognition. You start to understand that your capacity to love was never the issue. It was never too much. It was simply placed in a situation that could not hold it safely. And now, that same capacity, the same emotional depth, the same loyalty, the same sensitivity, is no longer being drained in cycles of confusion. It is returning home to you. You, the one who survived, the one who kept breathing even when staying felt unbearable, when every ordinary moment felt heavier than it should, and when even silence seemed to echo with things you never fully said out loud. The one watching this right now and quietly recognizing themselves in every word, because something inside you is finally being given language it never received before. There is a strange relief in that, isn't there? Not because the pain disappears, but because it is finally seen, finally named, finally placed into something that makes sense instead of chaos. And if this is reaching you in a real way, then this is not just another passing message in your day. It is a pause in the pattern, a moment where something in you is asked to choose what comes next. Not because anything outside of you can rescue you, but because what you surround yourself with during rebuilding matters more than people ever realize. So if this message is speaking to something deep within you, stay connected here with the healing empath. Not as dependence, not as escape, but as alignment. Because healing does not happen in isolation alone. It strengthens when it is reflected back to you clearly, consistently, until your nervous system starts to believe a new reality is possible. The truth that most people never say out loud is this: what you went through did not destroy you. It exposed you. It revealed you in ways that comfort never could. It stripped away the surface level assumptions you had about love, about connection, about what it means to be chosen and to stay chosen. And underneath all of that, it exposed something rare in you. Your loyalty that does not switch off easily, your emotional depth that doesn't operate on the surface, your patience that often extends beyond what is healthy, your willingness to stay, to understand, to forgive, to keep believing even when reality gave you reasons to step back. These traits were never flaws, even though they may have been treated like weaknesses. They were simply placed in environments that could not hold them safely, could not reciprocate them consistently, and could not honor them with the same depth they were given. And that mismatch is where confusion begins. Because you start asking yourself questions that slowly bend your perception of who you are. Why wasn't I enough? Why did I have to try so hard? Why did love feel like something I had to maintain instead of something I could rest inside? But the real wound was never who you are. The wound was where you had to place yourself in order to be loved at all. And now something inside you is shifting, even if it is subtle, even if it is not fully conscious yet. There is a quiet rearrangement happening in how you see connection. You are beginning to understand, not just intellectually but emotionally, that love is not supposed to feel like constant tension in your chest. That connection is not meant to feel like walking carefully through emotional glass, always monitoring tone, timing, and silence just to keep things stable. Affection is not supposed to be something you earn by shrinking yourself, silencing parts of your truth, or constantly adjusting your behavior to prevent withdrawal. You are slowly recognizing that anything requiring you to abandon yourself repeatedly is not alignment, it is adaptation. And adaptation is not the same as love. This realization does not arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It arrives in fragments, in moments where you pause before over-explaining, in moments where you notice you are tired of guessing, in moments where your body reacts before your mind can justify it. And little by little, you begin to see that the right kind of love does not require self-erasure. It does not demand that you become less of yourself in order to remain included in it. And even with that awareness, the process is not linear. There will still be nights where your mind reaches backward, trying to find meaning in what happened. There will still be memories that rise without warning, tightening something in your chest before you even have time to name what you are feeling. There will be moments where silence feels louder than it should, and your thoughts begin rewriting the past just to make it easier to carry in the present. You might question yourself again. You might wonder if you overfelt everything, if you misread signs, if you made it bigger in your mind than it really was. That is not regression. It is the mind attempting to regain control over what once felt uncontrollable. The mind often tries to soften pain by reshaping it into something more survivable. But healing does not come from rewriting what happened. It comes from staying present with what is real, even when it is uncomfortable. It comes from choosing not to return to what fractured your sense of peace, even when familiarity tries to disguise itself as comfort. Every time you choose stillness over chaos, every time you stop chasing clarity from someone who repeatedly withheld it, every time you allow an emotion to pass without becoming it, you are rebuilding something far more important than the past. You are rebuilding the internal place where you live with yourself. And slowly, without forcing it, something begins to change in the background of your life. One day, it will not announce itself. It will not feel like a transformation or a breakthrough moment. It will feel ordinary. You might be doing something simple, making something warm to drink, walking without urgency, sitting in a quiet space where your mind is not racing in the same old patterns. And then you notice something unfamiliar in its absence. You haven't thought about them in a while, not in a consuming way, not in a looping way, not with that familiar emotional pull that used to interrupt your peace. There is no internal replay, no emotional negotiation, no ache trying to find resolution. Just distance, just quiet. Just space where intensity used to live. And in that moment, something inside you understands without needing explanation. The grip is loosening. The emotional cycle is no longer controlling your inner world the way it once did. And the version of you who once begged for clarity, who once overgave, who once stayed far longer than your peace allowed, begins to feel less like your present identity and more like a chapter you have finally moved through. And from that space, a different version of you begins to form. Not overnight, not perfectly, but steadily. A version that is quieter inside, not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer in constant emotional conflict. A version that is more aware, not because it is guarded, but because it has learned from experience. Someone who no longer confuses intensity with intimacy. Someone who no longer mistakes emotional inconsistency for depth. Someone who understands that being needed is not the same as being valued, and that real love does not require self-abandonment as proof of devotion. This version of you does not need to chase what is uncertain in order to feel alive. It does not confuse anxiety with connection. It does not mistake absence for mystery. And most importantly, it does not negotiate its own worth in exchange for someone else's inconsistency. And this version is not something you are waiting to become in the future. It is already forming through every moment you choose yourself differently now. Because what you are going through is not your ending, it is your transition. The pain you feel is not where your story stops, it is where your awareness begins. And over time, the same heart that once felt overwhelmed, confused, and fractured by someone who could not meet it will become the very heart that recognizes peace without questioning it, that trusts stability without suspicion, that no longer needs chaos to feel connection. And one day, when you look back, you will see it clearly without emotional distortion. You were never too much. You were never the problem to be solved. You were someone who loved deeply in a place that simply did not know how to receive depth without misunderstanding it. And now, step by step, moment by moment, without needing to rush or force anything, you are returning, not to who you were before everything happened, but to someone more grounded, more aware, and finally, more at home within yourself. In the end, healing is not about getting answers from the person who hurt you. It is about finally choosing yourself over the cycle that broke you. The pain will fade, the confusion will clear, and one day you will realize you are no longer searching for closure because you became it. You were never too much. You were simply learning to come home to yourself.